Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk to you about agriculture and water and what I believe the future holds for all of us. I have a quote here from Henry Ford, whose ancestors came from Cork. There are two reasons why I picked this. One, I really agree with it. We need to understand where everyone is coming from, whether you're an environmentalist and agriculturalist. We need to understand each other's point of view. Henry Ford's ancestors came from Cork, and 22% of the dairy cows in Ireland are now in the county of Cork. And that's placing huge pressure on local water supply and on the quality of biodiversity and on the environment down in Cork. We need to understand that the regulation that we have so far, it's been a blanket regulation that we've applied equally across the country, but we need to look at local solutions to local issues. The first thing we need to think about is biodiversity. The rate of extinction has accelerated dramatically since the early 1900s. And there are a number of drivers here. It's not just agriculture. Demographic, socio-cultural, economic and technological. These are all reducing the species that are there. And as you've probably read in the Farm to Fork or heard from Leanne earlier, the biodiversity strategy estimates that the protected areas around Europe are worth between 2 and 300 billion euro each year. So we can't continue to allow biodiversity to be damaged and to lose it at the speed we're losing it at the moment. We need to think about soil quality. 90 to 92% of Ireland is grass. It's a grass-based country, grass-based production system where we have grazing livestock. And yet we know that only less than a fifth of the land in Ireland is at agronomic optimum, which means it has the right pH, which is the level of whether you need it's lime or not. And we know that we're losing carbon stock from our organic soils every year. We know that we're not sequestering all the carbon that we could in soils. And we know that fertilizer use increased this year by about 1% so far. The number of livestock have gone up significantly since the ending of quota in 2015. And more land is going into grassland all the time. And we know that about 20% of the land in Ireland is used by dairy farms. And on that land, about 50% of the fertilizer is applied. And normally what happens when agricultural intensification takes place is that you get drainage so that grazing can be extended and so on. But this is damaging soil quality that we have. We're also getting structural damage through heavy machinery. We're getting damage from animals grazing land that's unsuitable at certain times of the year. And this needs to be remedied. We also know that there's about 1/3 of the biodiversity on Earth in our soils. And yet I think we don't pay enough attention to it. Be that as farmers or as advisors or people that are talking to farmers. We need to give the message, and farmers need to understand that we need to look after our soils before we can improve the environment around us. Biodiversity is key for sustainable development. What you see on the right-hand side of the screen are the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed by the UN and that Ireland have signed up to. And what it shows really is that all of these are interlinked to deal with land, soil, water, and knowledge. Sharing knowledge and understanding each other are so important. But society can't function properly if we don't respect our environment. It's a key threat for humanity. Almost half of global GDP is linked to biodiversity. And after the pandemic or during the pandemic that we're in at the moment, the key to recovery will be respecting biodiversity and placing it at the core of any recovery plan. There's been an awful lot of talk about climate in the last few years. And what this is here is the Teagasc greenhouse gas marginal abatement cost curve. And what that means is that Teagasc have done a lot of research and work, and they've identified measures that will have an impact, a major impact, on greenhouse gas losses from agriculture, which make up 1/3 of all the losses, or of all the contribution to greenhouse gases in Ireland comes from agriculture. And what you see is that those ones below the x-axis are cost neutral. So they'll actually help make money for a farmer. So things like nitrogen use efficiency, animal health and welfare are so important, and they're subjects that we don't probably talk enough about. We want to have animals healthy, but the consumer also wants to have animals of a high welfare standard. Dairy EBI means breeding animals using genetics to improve the efficiency of animals. Extended grazing. Every week or every day we can have an animal at grass helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And when we move on to the right, we can see things there that will cost money, and these can be either incentivized or regulated for, or perhaps there can be tax breaks around it, but things like fertilizer type. So, for example, using to protected urea, changing the diet of pigs, low emission slurry spreading. The Department of Agriculture has granted almost 2,700 machines so far. Instead of blowing slurry up into the air using a splash plate, farmers are now applying it in low-lying bands or lines on land so that you reduce ammonia emissions. Because we know that 99% of emissions of ammonia losses in Ireland come from agriculture. And what's important here is that there is a plan around greenhouse gases. It's not just something we're talking about. These are measures that farmers can take today, and they need to start taking them straight away, because our targets are set for 2030, but the longer we leave to start to achieve them, the harder it's going to be to get there. Moving on to water, this is a slide from the EPA, and what it shows is that there's about an equivalent loss from urban wastewater treatment plants and agriculture as regards phosphorus, because it's often said when you talk about pollution from agriculture, well, we have all these septic tanks around the country, we have towns and villages that don't have treatment systems, and what about those? So yes, there definitely are a problem. And as regards phosphorus, they're about the same, agriculture and treatment systems. But if you look at the chart on the right, you'll see that agriculture, which is the green line plus the yellow, or the green bar plus the yellow, is about 10 times as significant as wastewater. And these figures are based on 2012 data. The EPA have received up-to-date data from agriculture, from the Department of Agriculture, in the past couple of months, due to a new memorandum of understanding being agreed. But since 2015, or before that, we have an extra 400,000 dairy cows in the country. So the likelihood is that the losses from agriculture have increased. Because these increases, this increase in cow numbers, they haven't occurred evenly across the country. A third of all the increase has occurred in counties Cork, Kilkenny and Tip. And almost half the cows in the country are in those three counties. So you can see that there's significant pressure there. And that's borne out when we look at the distribution around the country. Urban sources are very important for phosphorus losses, but agriculture is really important for nitrogen. And what we need to realise as well is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. We have some very extensive farmers and we have some very intensive farmers, but depending on the soil type, the extensive farmer may be losing as much phosphorus as the intensive farmer. So everybody has a role to play here. But what is important to note is where the intensive agriculture is in the east and southwest of the country, in the southeast, we have very high losses of nitrogen from agriculture. And this is just to set a context around the whole thing. So what is the farm structure in Ireland? So you can see that over half the farmers in Ireland have a standard output of less than 15,000 per year. And a very small number are operating over 50,000. So about 20% have an output of of greater than 50,000. 12% of farms produce 62% of output on only 1/3 of the land. So you can see that we have a very intensive cohort of farmers. About 11,000 farmers own 1/3 of all the livestock in the country, of all the cattle in the country. And dairy farmers, there are about 17,000, 18,000 dairy farmers, have almost half the livestock in the country. And when we're designing measures or talking about regulation, we need to talk about individual farmers, about different farming types and about different soil types. Because we can't just continue talking about agriculture and say that these people that are extensive and using low amounts of fertilizer should be treated the same as those that are intensive. At the same time, these extensive farmers have a lot to offer as regards biodiversity. We need to make sure that the nutrient management that they're carrying out on their farm is good, that they are, if they're using fertilizer, that they're using it efficiently. But we do need to take into account the different incomes that are available on the different types of farms, because that'll play into what type of lever is going to work to cause change. So if you have someone that's making under 15,000 a year, telling them that they're going to make an extra 5 or 10% by using a nutrient management plan is not going to have the same significance as dealing with someone that's making over 50 or up to 100,000 a year. So we need to engage in behavioural change and get cultural change on farms so that people can accept and see there are good practices there. You're going to have a talk from Donald Sheehan, who's heavily involved in the Bride project, a dairy farmer down in Cork. And he's going to explain that dairy farmers are interested, very interested in biodiversity, and they're doing a lot around it. But it's not just regulation, it's not just incentive. We need for people to understand why we want them to change and what exactly they want to do. And at the same time, we need to acknowledge, and people should be paid for it, the good things that are being done on farms. What's really important when we're making policy is that we appreciate that there is no silver bullet for agriculture, but that everything you do, if we come up with a measure that benefits soil, we need to make sure that that's not just going to have pollution displacement. Or for biodiversity, if we have a measure for biodiversity that's going to cause more water pollution, it's pointless. So really what we need is, looking back at the Teagasc MACC for greenhouse gases, we need something the same for the environment, so that we can say, what are the best measures we can put in place that are going to benefit biodiversity, air, soil, water, and climate? And then we'll make progress. And there are a number of different ways to do this. One of these is regulation. So a way of causing change in agriculture in the future, and it has been, we've had the nitrates regulations since the end of 2005, early 2006, and it's caused significant change on farm and in farmer behaviour. This year in the next month, a review process will be started as regards to nitrates regulation, which is in place until the end of next year. And the first thing that's going to happen is a consultation document will be published to ask people's opinions about what should happen next. Like, we have this blanket regulation. How are we going to make changes that will have an actual impact on water quality? In New Zealand, in the last couple of weeks, what they've done is place a limit on the amount of nitrogen that can be applied to land. But when you talk to researchers, they say, well, if you limit the amount of nitrogen on land, we'll have to just go and buy feed that's going to be imported maybe from South America and result in deforestation. Because if we can't grow the grass, we'll have to get the feed in from somewhere else. So perhaps that's not a solution. Should we have a limit on total nitrogen that can be applied to land between livestock manure and chemical fertilizer? We know that we need to look at low emission slurry spreading equipment, and we know that at the moment all derogation farmers have to use it. We need to do more around biodiversity. This year, for the first time, a measure was introduced where it becomes compulsory for derogation or these heavily stocked farmers to do more for biodiversity. The people in the middle are all important, because these are farmers. And if we don't talk with farmers and listen to what farmers are saying to us, we're not going to make any progress at all. In fact, we actually might do harm, because farmers know their own land best, and they need to be part of arriving at the solution. And we also have agricultural advisors, and we need to build on the knowledge that these advisors have. And in the next CAP, knowledge transfer and knowledge innovation is a huge part of seeking to change what's happening on farms and bring us towards the area where we want to be, which is producing a good quality food where farmers are getting a reasonable income and it's sustainable. So farmers are being paid for what they're doing. At the moment, what we have is a cheap food policy where farmers are expanding because they're not making an income from agriculture. And they're not being rewarded. We talk all the time about ecosystem services and paying farmers for producing more for the environment. But when you go into the shop, you don't see that in the price. And the farmer definitely doesn't see it in his or her pocket, in what's going back to them. That they're going to get more for their milk, or more for their meat, or more for their grain, because they've produced it to very high standards. And it's very difficult to see how we're going to cause change unless a farmer can afford it. Because when we look back, if you look back at the structure of the industry there and the number of farmers that are on a relatively small income and are dependent on subsidies for their livelihood, is it fair to ask them to do more for the environment when they aren't being paid for their goods? In fact, we know that some of them are operating at a loss, and without subsidies, they wouldn't continue. So what are we going to do around that? On May the 20th, the Farm to Fork strategy and the Biodiversity strategy were launched. And these are aiming to cause significant changes by 2030. They aren't legal instruments, they're strategies. But what we have been told is that when the next CAP is being developed, that Leanne talked about, the Commission will proof them against the Farm to Fork strategy and the Biodiversity strategy. So, for example, a target is to reduce fertilizer use, pollution from fertilizers by 50% by 2030, reduce fertilizers by 20%. How are we going to grow the grass that's needed to feed the animals and reduce the fertilizer? So farmers have to become more efficient. And efficiency on its own is not going to achieve it. There has to be more money brought into the system. One way of bringing in this money is like they're doing in Holland. This is just a screenshot of a page from Rabobank, who have combined with Friesland Campina, and they'll give farmers lower interest loans, depending on the amount of biodiversity on their farms. Friesland Campina will give farmers extra money per each litre of milk if they have a higher percentage of biodiversity on their farms. One or two of the co-ops in Ireland have dipped their toes in this, but would you, watching this as a consumer, pay more if you go into a shop and see a litre of milk for €1 or for €1.20, and one with €1.20 is coming from a farm where there's higher levels of biodiversity? Because that's sending a real signal to farmers. And at the moment, we're not in that space. Where we need to get to is this perfect nexus. And that would be, if you look at the middle triangle there, promote education and knowledge generation and sharing. We know that we can do regulation. We know that we can do incentives through CAP, but CAP on its own is not going to cause the changes we need. We know that there are taxation policies. So, for example, there used to be issues in Ireland, or there still are issues around land mobility. So tax incentives were brought into place around leasing. And these have been very successful and seen the number of leases increase. We need a coherent policy. So, for example, taxation policies encourage farmers to use more environmentally beneficial equipment, like low emission slurry spreaders, like precision application of fertilizers, precision application of pesticides. We need to internalize the cost of food, because at the moment, the cost to the environment isn't included in the price that the consumer pays, and it's not included in the price that a farmer receives for their milk. So we are actually damaging the environment. And until that changes, it's going to be very, very difficult. We need to think of diversification. Recently at a meeting, a colleague from the EPA, Jenny Deacon, brought up that perhaps we should be looking at producing honey, just as an example, on farms. And I looked up honey exports in New Zealand, and there were 380 million a year. They increased from 100 million in less than 10 years up to 380 million. Now, maybe in Ireland, honey is not going to work because we have a shorter season, but we have to start thinking of other ways. Farming is not just about dairy or sheep or cattle or tillage. There are other things that can be produced from it, and farmers need to look around at that, because if you're making a loss as a farmer, keeping doing the same thing over and over, it's not going to change. So what can we get into? What are the opportunities there? And move towards them. But that's easier said than done. The most important thing that we can do as people, though, is think about what we are doing as individuals. Think about the actions that you take that have an impact on the environment, and the money that you spend, and how that's going to be used as a lever to cause change. If you have any questions about anything I've said over the last few minutes, please use the app, and we'll try and answer them as best as we can. Thank you very much.